Hi everybody. So today this video is going to talk to you a little bit about the discussion section. And so I posted the discussion section um, PowerPoint, and so I'm just going to go through it for this video. So feel free to minimize me because you don't need to look at my face. And we'll go through the lectures. The first half of the lecture is actually talking about some critiques based on briefly what I saw in the introduction section. Please note that this is super normal and typical because introduction sections are really difficult to write, and so there's a lot of common themes. So use these critiques as kind of like as a way to help, and you can edit the introduction section until it's due this Sunday. So normally what I would do is actually edit your introduction section before you write the rest of your paper. That didn't work out this semester, which is fine. So I'm providing you this general feedback so that you can use it to edit before you submit the final one on Sunday. Okay, so I'm on slide 1 of the discussion section lecture. And now I'm on slide 2. And so there's 3 major categories that need improvement: overall clarity, APA style, and level of detail. So let's cover APA style first. It's really important that you use all the subheadings that we talked about in each section, and that the headings need to just be simply bolded, right? A lot of headings are in different font, different sizes, underlined, italicized, fancy little Microsoft Word feature. Simple, simple, simple. Remember, APA style wants your paper to be the most boring paper in the world. And if you're writing a boring paper, then you're doing a good job. If you're having issues with in-text citations, you can always refer back to our slides, the APA manual, and again, the OWL Purdue website. They're really wonderful at kind of giving snapshots of examples for students that students find helpful over semesters. Penn State also has a writing lab website. You can go through libraries, I believe, and find help with in-text citations. The second thing is clarity, overall clarity. So the first one is understanding of your articles. So I know that it's really difficult when you're writing about your article. So let's say you're reading the Wookiee et al. And if you're a Star Wars fan, Wookiee et al. Is like the perfect name. But if you're reading the Wookiee et al. Article and you're trying to summarize it in your intro, but you don't really understand it, then you're going to have a really difficult time stating what it is they did and what it is that they found, right? So a lot of times what happens is students copy and paste and then change a couple words around. That's plagiarism. Or they'll just ramble on for 3-4 sentences and it doesn't make sense, okay? So one, you can't just plop in a citation and expect it to be enough. You have to break down the article into 4 quote-unquote questions, right? So what do they do? How do they do it? Why did they do it? Or what was their rationale, hypotheses, and what does that finding mean, okay? So simply stating this person did an experiment and they found this is not adequate for this paper in order to describe their research. So I'm going to show you an example of how you break down an article and what the beginning of the paragraph, the middle of the paragraph, and the end of the paragraph may be like. So you don't know this article, it doesn't matter what it's about, but I'll read it to you. So the beginning of the paragraph is, there's a great deal of experimental evidence for a positive association between healthy diets and improved mental health performance. So this is just setting up that and leading you in from whatever your previous paragraph was to now I'm going to talk about healthy diets and mental performance. Okay. For example, Bering and Stein, the article I'm reviewing, investigated how diet impacted 4th graders' FCAT scores. FCAT scores in Florida are standardized test scores. So I told you what they were seeking to do. In their study, one group of children ate a strict low-calorie diet while the other group ate only KFC. You could tell I made up this study. I love KFC. At the end of a 2-week period, all children were given FCAT exams. So I told you how they did it. They found that on average, the children who ate the low-calorie diet scored 28% higher than the children who ate only KFC. So normal results sections have like lots of statistics, right? But notice that I took all the statistics that are normally in the results and I summarized it into one sentence. They found that on average, the children who ate the low-calorie diet scored 28% higher than the children who only ate KFC. The authors concluded that healthy diets were conducive to mental performance. That is what that finding means, okay? So in this paragraph, I was able to lead you in from a previous paragraph and introduce what I'm going to talk about. I was able to tell you why they did it, what they did, how they did it, and what they found, right? So breaking down each one of those doesn't have to be lots of words and lots of paragraphs. It can be summarized really briefly in one. Okay, so use this kind of quote-unquote template if you need help rewriting your summaries of your introduction. So these are just like tips for making sure that your writing is understandable by someone else. So first and foremost, understand the study that you're describing. The hardest thing to do and the least followed advice from my students is read your writing out loud. So we all know what's in our head, right? So we all know that when I want to talk about XYZ, like I'm just going to write it and it's going to be there. And everyone else that is reading it is going to understand exactly what's in my head. But that's not really the case. If you've ever read someone else's writing, you may have noticed that you might be really confused, but they think that they're really clear. So the hardest thing is, one, have someone else read it, and then read it out loud. So when you read it out loud, it's not just in your head where your brain fills in the blanks of what you mean, and you can actually see or hear what it sounds like. It's a really usually difficult thing because we tend to realize like, oh, that didn't make sense, or that doesn't flow at all. That's not what I meant. We hear it differently. Also, don't make any assumptions that the reader knows what you're talking about. I know you're writing this paper and I'm grading it, but you're not writing this paper for me. You're writing it for the field, quote unquote, right? We're pretending that you're going to publish this paper. And so if that's going to happen, you're going to have lots of people that read it, not just one person that knows what it is that you're talking about. So think of it in terms of like, it's almost like a balance between writing scientifically and writing in a way that your grandmother can understand it. So you're going to read articles that are super difficult to understand. Those are poorly written articles. They might get published because they did the science very well, but they didn't do a very good job of writing it up. So your job is to write scientifically with enough content, but also write it enough where anybody reading it can understand it. And just as a quick reminder, and this is pretty much true for any college writing assignment, using a bunch of big words makes you sound like you ate a thesaurus. It doesn't make you sound smart. It makes it sound like you copied and pasted a sentence and then you're like, I don't want to get caught for plagiarism, so I'm going to use the thesaurus and find a synonym for this word, and you found the most ridiculous one. It just sounds terrible. Okay. And this is just clarifying writing style in terms of paragraphs. So your paper should overall have a clear structure. The order of the paragraph should make sense. Within each paragraph, you have to have a topic sentence, right? It's usually the first sentence, like the example I showed you, and then subsequent sentences should support that topic sentence. Don't talk about multiple studies at once. Don't try to take in all the concepts into one sentence. So there was one sentence that talked about gender stereotypes affecting perception, and gender discrimination all in one sentence. And it's like, it's too many concepts, right? Break it down. Okay, now I'm on slide 10. We're going into the discussion section. So please take a minute to look at the first 10 slides just as a way for you to edit your introduction section. Okay, discussion section. So the purpose of the discussion section is first and foremost where you interpret and evaluate your findings. So in the results section, the one that came right before, right, you got to analyze your data, but you did not get to interpret your data, right? You just got to see what the numbers were they significant, were they not significant, but you didn't talk about what those numbers mean. And so the discussion section is where you do that, okay? So it's where you have the opportunity to tell your reader what all those lovely fancy stats actually mean in normal terms, right? And also your job here is to address your introduction in light of your results, aka your hypothesis. So what is it that you hypothesized? Did you find it? Does your data support it or not? All right, I'm on slide 12. And so your discussion section will be organized into 4 parts, not subsections, meaning there are no subheadings in the discussion section. But there are 4 components to a discussion section. So the first one is reviewing your hypotheses and results, right? Did the results confirm and support your hypotheses? The second is discuss the findings in context of the existing literature. So go back to your introduction, all right? Do your findings go along with what others have found? Is there any contradictions between what you found and what other people have found, right? So based on all those that you reviewed in your introduction, does your data fall in line with that or not? And if so, how? The third component is addressing the limitations of your study. What limitations were there? Was there were you in a noisy room? Was it a potential problem that it was a online format where you can change your scores maybe, or maybe somebody didn't follow instructions correctly? Could it be that we used a within subjects design and that was probably not the best case, given that after the first slide you probably already picked up on the purpose of the experiment, and that might skew your results or hinder your ability to make a judgment impartially, right? And then 4, summarizing the study's contribution to the field and providing suggestions for future research. So now that you have the gist of what the study means, what would you propose future research should do? Where can we go from here? Okay, so I'm on slide 13. So we're just going to go over those 4 components. So the first one is reviewing hypotheses and results. So restate your goal and your hypothesis, right? The purpose of the study was to blah, blah, blah. We tested this using blah, blah, blah. Our results suggest that, okay? And so you're going to state whether or not the findings supported your hypotheses. You can write it in terms of like, this present findings fail to support the hypothesis, or as expected, participants provided with salty foods, blah, blah, blah. If your findings do not support the hypothesis, you have to explain sort of why you think that happened, right? This is kind of like the only time you're allowed to necessarily speculate, and you state a rationale for why you think you didn't find what you thought you were going to find. If your findings have any unexpected results, which I don't think that we do, you state and explain that as well. So slide 14, so really quickly, what was our finding? Well, you should have had a hypothesis about a main effect for attire, right? Whether you thought wearing a blazer or not wearing a blazer would impact overall competency scores. And thankfully, yay, we find that our data supports our hypothesis. The participants, aka you all, rated those who wore blazers as significantly more competent overall than those who did not wear a blazer, regardless of job type or job description. Slide 15. What about a main effect for job description? You should have had a hypothesis about main effect for job description, meaning regardless of what they're wearing, is there a significant difference between overall competency scores between those that were described as CEOs and those that were described as assistants? And your data should support your hypothesis, right? Participants, again, you all rated those who are CEOs as significantly more competent overall than those who were described as assistants, regardless of what they wore. You also should have had a hypothesis about the interaction between attire and a job description. So I would have hypothesized that CEOs not wearing a blazer may have been rated significantly lower, more so than, let's say, assistants not wearing blazers, right? But our data does not support that hypothesis. There was no significant interaction suggesting that ratings for competency for attire was not dependent on job description, right? The two independent variables do not interact significantly, where they don't differ on this dependent variable. Slide 17. So now the second component is relating your findings to the literature. Again, this is where you're going to discuss how your study's results fit in with other studies that have already been published. Are they similar? Are they different? And these are just some example sentences. You may use these, by the way. I'm giving them to you. It won't make sense contextually, but the format is the same, right? So you can say, consistent with this model discussed in this article, the current study revealed that, blah, 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 right? Or unlike Hintzman and colleagues, the current findings show that we don't support this hypothesis, right? Slide 18. The third component is addressing limitations. Again, you're going to name at least 2 or 3 limitations, and there are plenty in this study because we used a very simple design. We used a within subjects design, which should not be the ideal situation for this study. Even the Wookey et al. Was a between subjects design, which would have been better for us, but we didn't have that ability. And so what would that mean? Like, does that change our findings? Probably. It was in an online format, so perhaps even though I told you not to change your scores, maybe once you figured out what the study was about, you're like, oh, I get it now. I'm going to change the scores. So you're going to name those limitations, and if those limitations are significant, right, you can address maybe some alternative explanations for the findings that we have. So maybe one explanation for not finding an interaction was that people may have changed their scores, lowering the scores in some ways and hiring the scores in another. And overall, the scores were really high. Nobody rated anybody as a 2 or 3 or 4. Notice that all the scores were on the middle to higher end of the spectrum. And the fourth component, I'm on slide 19, is contributions and future research. So you're going to provide a suggestion or 2 for future research moving forward. So future research should focus on understanding whether these are implicit or explicit, right? Or future research should try and test this using both professional, student, and non-working class individuals to see if there are differences, right? Whatever your future research suggestion may be. Okay. Also in this section, you're going to discuss why the findings are important. This can be really brief, but how does that study add to the real world, right? What does this mean beyond just academia, beyond just the study? Okay, on slide 20. So really general tips: don't overgeneralize, stick to your variables, your theory, your rationale. Don't talk about the brain or any other mechanism that we didn't test. Like, don't say, oh, the brain categorizes men and women differently. Nope, it's not what happens, not at all. So we're going to avoid talking about the brain. And make sure you don't ignore the results that were not significant. Those are equally meaningful to discuss in this study and actually all studies. We should discuss all null results just as we discuss significant results. And then I'm on slide 21. Really quickly, just the APA style of the discussion section. The discussion section heading is just discussion, bolded, centered, and it follows right after the results section. It's not on its own separate page, and that's about it. And please also, if you're going to cite anybody in the discussion section, which you should, make sure that you use the proper in-text citations. Okay. So that's all for the discussion section and some critiques on your intros. I hope that's useful information for you. If you have any questions, please let me know.